Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final session in Seeds of Change, Avenues for Action. We're really thankful that you're able to be here with us today and look forward to this closing session after a full week. So my name is Mercedes Williams, and I'm the Training and Events Manager here at the Jubilee Centre. So as I mentioned, this week we have looked at a diversity of topics, from macroeconomic policy and household debt to the social purpose of business, food systems and environmental disconnection, and technology. It's really been a fascinating week as we've looked at some of the landscapes post-COVID with the question of how do we seek human flourishing and institutional reform in this new context. And we've hosted more than 15 speakers from various disciplines and various countries as well, and have had the privilege of a diverse and international audience too. So today, however, we're actually going to be closing this conference by looking at a seed of change from within the Jubilee Centre itself through conversation with our current director, Jonathan Tame, and 3 of our current trustees. Unfortunately, due to illness, our 4th trustee, Sue Halliday, is unable to join us, but we're very, very glad to have a previous trustee, Julie Lacey, who's here in her place and will moderate the event. And before I introduce Julie to you, just a few quick notes about the webinar itself, how it will run. So as we go forward, if you have any questions, please could you use the Q&A function and put your questions in there, because there will be a time for discussion at the end where we'd love to hear what's on your mind. And please do make use of the chat function as well. And my colleague Elizabeth Taylor will be kind of moderating that throughout the event. So now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Julie Lacey. So Julie is a former trustee of the Jubilee Centre and also worked for the organization in the late 80s. But now she's an electric vehicle charging specialist, which to me sounds just fascinating. And having completed her PhD in electric vehicle batteries at Northumbria University in 2015. She's a research engineer and teaches on EV batteries, V2G, and smart charging, which again, fascinating. Julie is currently a senior lecturer at Teesside University in Middlesbrough. So with this background in innovation and future-facing strategies to tackle major global challenges, Julie is going to lead us through this closing event of our Seeds of Change conference, where we look back on the last 10 years of the Jubilee Centre and look forward to the future. So Julie, it's a pleasure to pass this over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mercedes. It's really good to be here. As you've probably realised, it was meant to be Sue, and I was recruited at the very last minute. But it's so nice to be back with old friends and colleagues from the Jubilee Centre, especially at this pivotal time as we see the changes in the Jubilee Centre going on. I've been involved one way and another with the Jubilee Centre since 1987, I believe. So yeah, a long time. But what we're going to think about today are seeds of change in the Jubilee Centre. This is a season of change for the Jubilee Centre because after 10 years, our director, who's been leading the charity for 10 years, is stepping down. He's going to get involved in the challenges around housing in Britain as his new job. You can imagine he's not going to do nothing. At this event, though, he's going to give us a retrospective, a thoughts of what is meant to be part of the Jubilee Centre, lead the Jubilee Centre over these last decade. And he's going to outline 5 most significant things that he's learned during his tenure about the calling of God's people to be both salt and light, and what it means to engage in biblical social reform today. Some of the Jubilee Centre trustees are also going to offer their own reflections over the last decade and give an indication of what's going to happen in the new season when the new director takes over. So that is the plan for this afternoon. I hope you're looking forward to it as much as we are. So let me just introduce to you, as I'm sure you're aware already, of Jonathan. Jonathan is still our director, our outgoing director. He's going to talk a little bit about what he's been doing in a minute. He's been the director of the Jubilee Centre for the last decade. He oversees research, publications, events and training programme within a small team in central Cambridge. Prior to that, he and his wife Ellen spent 11 years in Romania, pioneering community development projects, starting a crisis pregnancy centre, engaging with the Orthodox Church, opening an arts and worldview cafe. In 2006, they moved to Switzerland, where Jonathan was involved in training, arts and media projects in order to inform and inspire Christians working in the international community. Jonathan is going to talk about that in a short while. What we also want to introduce to you the trustees that are able to be here today. The trustees will be part of the Q&A at the end as they also think about the last 10 years. So let's start with our head trustee, what's the word? Chief trustee, most important trustee. Anyway, Ralph Lee, chair of trustees, has worked with the Navigators for over 30 years, mainly in Ethiopia, where he first taught engineering and then later theology, having a strong interest in understanding the Orthodox Church better. He now lives in Cambridge with his wife Sarah and their 2 children, Georgie and Seb. He divides his time between teaching at the Oxford Centre of Mission Studies, academic work on Ethiopian Christianity, supporting the Lausanne Orthodox Initiative, which promotes joint mission projects between the Orthodox and Evangelical Christians, working as a trustee of the Jubilee Centre, and meeting with people in Cambridge, seeking them to help grow in their walk with Jesus. We've also got with us Tim Adams, who I think has been a trustee the longest. So he has been involved probably at least as long as I have, actually. And he is also the General Secretary of IFES, International Fellowship of Evangelical Students. I believe that stands for. If I'm wrong, I'm sure Tim will change it for me. Over his 22-year history with the organisation, he's developed and organised innovative ministry projects, initiatives to pioneer student groups, and grants to emphasise scripture engagement. As you can imagine, he travels extensively to support national movements and joins global consultations. And that's given him powerful first-hand experience of the diverse cultural contexts in which IFES operates, as well as strong relationships worldwide. Tim has a BA in theology from the London School of Theology and an MA in managing change and organisation learning from Oxford Brookes. He and his wife, Sophie, have 3 children and live in Oxford. Third trustee I want to introduce to you today is Ross. Ross Hendry took over as the CEO of CARE in 2021. Oh, I didn't know that, Ross. Prior to joining the team, he was CEO of Spurgeon's, that's what I remember, one of the UK's largest children's charities. He's also served as Deputy CEO at the Office for the Children's Commissioner in London and as Head of Public Policy at Action for Children. In 2005, he stood as a parliamentary candidate for the Labour Party. Ross is a long-standing trustee of the Jubilee Centre. Those are the trustees we have with us today. So what I'd like to do now is to ask Jonathan to take over from here and to give us his perspective over these last 10 years. He's given it some careful thought, and we're looking forward very much to hearing what you have to say, Jonathan. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gilly, and thank you for stepping in just at the very last minute and for the introductions to these amazing trustees I've worked with over these years. I'm just going to give a bit of a glimpse to start with of some highlights over the last decade. And rather than a long list and lots of facts and figures and statistics, I'll just do that visually with, I've picked out a couple of photos from each year from the past decade. So let me share my screen and see if this is going to come out. Here we go. A 10-year retrospective of Jubilee Centre. So we're going to start 2012, the year I began as director at the beginning of January 2012. And one of the first things we did was to publish the Jubilee Roadmap, which there had been the Jubilee Manifesto, a great big book several years earlier, and we wanted a really short and more visually powerful version of that, and that's the Jubilee Roadmap. We also brought out After Capitalism, which is a collection of Cambridge papers. The first big conference which we held was around debt. And it's funny, we've come round again to talk a lot about debt. But that was kind of getting started with publications and events. 2013, we had another new initiative, Forming a Christian Mind, which is a collaboration between different organizations in Cambridge for postgraduates and postdocs, drawing them together in Cambridge. That was the very first meeting we had, and they meet twice a year, and in fact tomorrow is going to be this year's autumn event. We also brought out a film that year called Reality Checkpoint, and that was a fascinating way of trying to explore the four big isms. That's capitalism, individualism, consumerism, and big statism, we called it. Socialism didn't seem to be quite the right word anymore, but we told that story in a 22-minute film around the life of Dave, a new graduate, and how those four big ideas were influencing his choices and options going forward. Then in 2014, a couple of highlights were the rebranding. We brought out a whole new, everything came out in color, made Cambridge papers, brought images into Cambridge papers, and redid our visual branding for Engage as well. We also launched in the Houses of Parliament our latest edition of VoteWise, which is trying to help people to think through the issues ahead of a general election. And there's a picture of Stephen Timms and Stephen Crabb, two Christian MPs at the time, who were speaking at that launch in the House of Commons. Then in 2015, we moved offices into the centre of Cambridge and were able to open the Jubilee Lounge. That's a picture of it there, which is where all our in-house events and training take place. At the same time, we started a new series of publications of kind of coffee table versions of some of these key themes. And we brought out these short, very visual versions of how do we think biblically about all these different issues. That was our 2015 highlight there. The following year, we had the EU referendum, and we started with some hustings there. And there's a lineup of people for and against Brexit, which we held in the Eden Baptist Church in Cambridge. Very well attended, heated discussion, quite exciting. We brought out Digitally Remastered, another book, and held our first summer school, and that was the graduating dinner in that picture there at St. Catherine's College. 2017, yes, we went out to an event in Birmingham, where we launched our Resilient Business book for the second time to a group of over 100 business leaders in Birmingham there. We also marked the 500th anniversary of the Reformation by coming up with 95 new theses, or theses for today, about how Christians can engage in social reform around some of the pressing issues in the world. And so we put them up inside the Round Church in Cambridge, and we managed to find someone who looked very like Martin Luther to come and nail them on the door of the Round Church there as a bit of a reenactment of the Reformation, or at least of the 95 theses. In 2018, we followed that up with the unveiling of a sculpture exhibition that we'd commissioned, which marked that anniversary again with 5 remarkable sculptures interpreting the 5 solas of the Reformation. That was outside Great St. Mary's Church, right in the centre of Cambridge, where they stood for a year and a half, in fact. Also, we participated for the first time in the Cambridge Festival of Ideas, and this is one of the events that we put on. It was one of the few times where we regularly will address primarily non-Christian audience, and this is one of the first events that we had in that series. 2019, we launched our SAGE graduate program. These are the first 4 participants who spent 6 months with us, learning right across the board how to do research and think through an issue from a biblical perspective, publish it and communicate it. And their output was so good, they worked jointly on food, relationships and the environment, that we published a book called Thoughtful Eating on that topic. We also had another breakthrough event called The Conversational God that year, and I'll mention that a little bit later. Then in 2020, just before lockdown, we had an event where we were exploring the idea of communities of reform, and this was in the Jubilee Lounge, and we had Clifford and Monica Hill talking about the abolition movement and how they had been involved with as research advisors on the film Amazing Grace, about the story of Wilberforce and the abolitionists. And they lent us the prop. So on the floor there, you can see the very same prop that was used in the film, which was the petition of something like 1 million signatures that was rolled out down the floor of the House of Commons during the film. And we also had a year ago the first Seeds of Change conference, which was an opportunity to talk about the 3 task forces that we had set up to think about the world following the COVID pandemic. And finally, that takes us to 2021, which we concluded our digital transformation, everything. We kicked out, got rid of the old server and a few of the old desktops there, and everything is up on the cloud now. And that was incredibly fortuitous, the timing of that, providential really, because the day that our new website was launched was the same day or the day after we went into the first national lockdown in March last year. We also had the second SAGE graduate program, and this is the one of the students receiving their diploma from Ralph. So those are our 10 years, and I want to just go on now to talk a little bit about the, in a sense, my own reflections. There's all sorts of things I could talk about, having had the privilege of leading Jubilee Centre for the last 10 years. And what I want to do instead is perhaps just condense it into 5 things which I've learned, and or under 5 headings, let's say. I've learned many things, but let me start with the Bible. And over this decade, I've grappled with what biblical thinking really is. I've learned not to confuse the output, say a well-written Cambridge paper or other report, with the process of biblical thinking. And that's one reason why quite early on, I decided to put a real emphasis on training people to think biblically for themselves, rather than simply promoting our publications, which is a product of the author's biblical thinking. Because that's not enough. And I've learned as well in that process how to read the Bible so much more fruitfully, discovering how it is God's living word that can transform the way we approach topics in contemporary society. So, for example, what do you think the Bible says about hospital catering? About what? I hear you say. Well, I remember an amazing afternoon workshop in the Jubilee Lounge with the late Michael Hodson. He introduced that question and led us to reflect on a few verses in 1 Kings 19, when Elijah was exhausted and depressed, and an angel came to feed him. By entering into the narrative and asking pertinent questions, thinking about the emotional, mental, and physical condition that Elijah was in, and how those 3 things all interact with each other, we ended up with, in a sense, almost a strategy for hospital catering in order to meet those needs in an integrated way. Absolutely fantastic. Another example is the conference we ran in 2019, which I referred to, called The Conversational God. That was about learning the art of relational reading, as we called it. And over 2 days, around 30 people from several different countries sat in small groups to study a passage, exploring the relational dynamics in the text, and then talking about what they saw from their own cultural perspectives. It was an extraordinary eye-opener. We had people from the States, from Africa, from Kenya, from Australia, even from Mongolia, and to have the kind of that sort of diversity and richness, and by sitting all together around a table, everyone was on the same level, if you like. And we were able to listen to each other and hear things for the first time, perhaps outside our own kind of cultural perspective on the Bible, a true eye-opener. So thinking about the Bible, perhaps lessons to share more widely. I've put it in the form of 3 nevers. Never think that the Bible cannot be relevant to some topic in the world today. It is absolutely remarkable how God will speak through his word if we are open to it and take time and together discuss and talk about it. Secondly, never think that one passage in the scripture says everything about an issue. And thirdly, never assume that your own interpretation of a passage is the definitive one. We always have more to learn from each other in the body of Christ. That brings me on to the second heading, which is collaboration. And I've learned how fruitful collaboration can be with like-minded Christian organizations. As I took up this role 10 years ago, someone asked me how I would view the competition, organizations like LICC, CARE, or Evangelical Alliance. And I sensed clearly that God was saying, treat them as your allies. And the picture came to mind of the D-Day landings in 1944, where you had a variety of different national armies allied together, and the different armies would land on different beaches, but they were all allied together in that one overall objective. And we've been deeply encouraged. I've been so encouraged by the fruits of our collaboration, locally, nationally, and internationally. So in Cambridge, we launched Forming a Christian Mind, which you saw the picture of that twice yearly conference for postgrads and postdocs. And we do that together each year with Christian Heritage, the Kirby Lang Institute, Faraday Institute, the Christian Graduate Society, and more recently UCCF as well. And that's been a really unique and fruitful ministry collaboration. The Resilient Business Research Report, I talked about that launch in Birmingham and how we worked together on that with LICC and Faith in Business, which are local to Cambridge. And of course, we had in that report, it was really 8 different case studies of businesses set up by Christians and exploring how their values translated into their business over time and through different changes. The third collaboration was something we called More Than a Bailout in 2014. And this was when we gathered leaders from academia, the church, and civil society from across Europe for a remarkable salon meeting for 48 hours up in a place called Co overlooking Lake Geneva to discuss together a new narrative, an alternative narrative for European society at a time when everything was up in the air with the Eurozone crisis and so on. And that new narrative to be based on a biblical and relational policy framework. And that was organized together with the Christian Political Foundation for Europe, which is now called SALUX, and the Federation of European Catholic Family Associations. And together with them, we shared this overall vision for how can we bring Christian values into public life in a more fruitful way. The lesson there, I thought, that we can perhaps take away from this is, let's seek to be generous towards other Christians, other churches or mission organizations. And let's try and make collaboration the norm rather than the exception, especially when we think that we could do it ourselves and don't need other people. Let's remember Paul's warning about the parts of the body thinking they don't need each other in 1 Corinthians. The third headline or heading that I've learned is about relational thinking. And I spent a little over 2 years working for Michael Schluter, who originally founded Jubilee Centre, before I joined Jubilee Centre directly as director of the charity. And through Michael, I came to realize what a deceptively simple yet powerful concept it is to look at economic, social, or political issues through a relational lens. But the challenge was then and now, how do you translate that effectively into everyday life? And I knew I needed to learn how to do that. And I rather casually offered to write a weekly blog post, taking an article in the news and exploring it from a relational perspective. To each one, I added a pithy quote, a Bible reference, further reading and an idea for application. And this became Friday 5, that's what it was called. And once you commit to writing a weekly blog, it's hard to stop. You don't want to give up. And I'm really grateful for that, because I ended up writing over 150 posts up till 2013 or 2014. And the discipline of doing this proved to be a fantastic learning tool for me personally. And it's been wonderful to see other people's outlook being transformed as they embrace this same outlook, which we call relational thinking, like the director of Salux, Johannes de Jong, whose work among politicians across the continent is seeking to renew Christian democracy by rooting it in relational thinking. And Matt Williams right now, who's on our staff, is writing a new research report for Salux about this very issue. Or Gabika Urbanova from Slovakia, who is heading up the office of an MEP in Brussels. She came to our summer school a few years ago and discovered this key of relationships and how that unlocked for her a dynamic connection between her Christian faith and the world of policy that she was dealing with in the European Parliament. And she's ended up as a senior official in the Slovakian Ministry of Health, and I think was responsible for the vaccine program in Slovakia in recent months. So what's the wider lesson here? I would say let's keep picking up this relational lens and look at issues and problems through it. The powerful message is that if you attend to what's wrong in the underlying relationship, many times the more obvious problem or issue will then take care of itself. My fourth heading is image and word. So another key lesson I've learned is about the power of images and emotion as a complement to the power of words and reason. An abiding impression when I first visited the Jubilee Centre in, I think, probably 2009, was how much paper there was everywhere. Books, documents, reports, filing systems, shelves on every wall, but no artworks. As I was exploring how to communicate the biblical vision for personal and social transformation, I came to see how significant visual art could be in addition to words. And so I began to include the occasional painting in my blog, and I hosted an art exhibition as part of our 30th anniversary events. I introduced visual images in Cambridge papers, and when we moved our offices to central Cambridge, I put some artworks on some of the walls, not just bookshelves. And perhaps most significantly, we commissioned that sculpture exhibition to mark the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. And the idea there was to turn 5 core gospel themes of the Reformation into contemporary art to engage people in a whole new way, who would not stop and listen to preaching on the streets, but they would stop and engage with a sculpture exhibition out in the open air, as we saw. We are very much in now an image-driven age, an image-driven culture. Instagram has 1.4 billion users, YouTube 2.3 billion subscribers. And I learned that people are, as I'm sure you know too, increasingly led by their hearts, and their heads follow along after, not just when you're in love. We are not as rational as we economists like to think. And in such a visual age, the power of art to reach the soul is becoming more and more important, as it can bypass people's rational defenses against the gospel and go straight to their hearts. Let's face it, Hollywood is discipling Western society more than any other institution, including the church. So perhaps the wider lesson here is to learn to integrate more of the visual dimension into our personal spiritual lives, our worship together corporately, and our wider witness. And let's make space, more space for art and artists in our local churches. Then my 5th heading is time. We can use the term social transformation rather too easily, but by studying the lives of Christian social reformers, especially as we did in each of our summer schools, I've learned that social change takes many, many years. Anyone who wants to be intentional about trying to bend an institution towards biblical values and principles needs to commit to a long, hard journey with many obstacles and challenges along the way. Now, that's not to say there aren't some changes that seem to happen really quickly, not least if they're related to technology. But when it comes to changing institutions, it's a slow burn. Philip Powell, who developed and led our training programs until he moved to Tier Fund this summer, would often say, don't forget, we're playing the long game here. And that's one reason why we've been cultivating something of a strategy for social change that links up Christians who are called and committed to a particular issue where reform is needed. And a working title we came up with a couple of years ago is Communities of Reform, networks of people committed over the long term, which we say is a decade or more, to pursuing social reform around one issue together, inspired by a biblical vision for society. And these multidisciplinary and intergenerational associations or networks of people would commit to learning and praying together, supporting each other's initiatives around that common goal, and collaborate together around wider campaigns. And somewhat surprisingly, I found there was a real enthusiasm for this idea. I thought it was just some crazy idea I'd had. But the more we talked about it, the more we found that there are some people for whom it really resonates. And in an instant world, and a culture that tells us we can have what we want whenever we want it, many Christians, and not only believers, are longing for that sense of a long-term purpose, something to give your life to, and something that's really worthwhile. And to do that alongside others, that's in a way that's expressing the gospel and is ultimately for the glory of God. And when we held a training day, a workshop on communities of reform in March 2020, people came from as far away as Lebanon and even Australia to take part, just as the world was shutting down because of the COVID spread. One of the quotes we put up that day was, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." That's attributed to the social anthropologist Margaret Mead. So, lesson for all, let's be open to making long-term commitments to social reform and look out for others who might join us on that journey. Or else we may find that there's a group already who've made a start and we can resonate and connect with them and perhaps join them. So that's something it's still a little bit of a vision. It's not been put into practice yet, but one of the main reasons why I'm stepping down from being director of Jubilee Centre is to try and pioneer such a community of reform around the whole issue of housing in Britain. So maybe I'll have an opportunity a little bit later to say something more on that. But I think that's it. My time is up for now. And so I'm just going to hand back to Julie to go forward from here. Thank you.
Jonathan, that was amazing. Thank you. Really enjoyed listening to all that. Most of which I already knew, but it's amazing to be reminded of it. And I still miss Friday 5. That was a fabulous thing you did, but I appreciate how much work it was. Right. I'm sure that's given us all food for thought, but all our trustees have able to give us now a reflection, maybe of their own, but also based on what they've heard from Jonathan just now. So I understand, but Tim, Ross and Ralph are ready to do this. So we'll start with Tim, if that's all right with you. Tim Adams, Director of IFES, who's one of our long-standing trustees. Would you like to say a few words about your response to the last 10 years and to what Jonathan's been saying?
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Jonathan, for inviting me to share today. It's a real pleasure to be with you all. I think it's a really healthy thing for us to do, and a biblical thing to do, to take a moment to look back at the last 10 years and to take stock on where we are and where we're going. I've been connected with Jubilee Centre in some way for at least 16 years and have served as a trustee for the last 8 years. And it really has been a joy and a privilege to have got to know Jonathan a little bit over that time and to see how he's led the Jubilee Centre agenda through a very interesting and challenging time in public life It was great to see the pictures there that you shared, Jonathan, and be reminded of those different chapters in your period of service over the last years. But in some ways, what I want to think about is a little bit about what's going on in the background there. I don't know about you, but when I look back at how the world has changed in my lifetime, I think of it in seasons or eras, and each era has a different emphasis. So whatever our feelings might be about Thatcher, we got to know what she and her government stood for in the 1980s. And whatever our feelings were about Blair and New Labour, there was a clear agenda that they were working towards, at least for the first few years. And as I was thinking about today, I start to wonder, how will we look back on the era of the last 10 years? There's been 3 general elections, there's been 2 referendums and a global pandemic. And over the course of those things, many significant issues for public debate. But I think that in the last decade, it's not only the issues that have gradually shifted and moved on, it's the way that we deal with them, which has changed so dramatically. The tone and the style of public discourse has moved into a new era. As a society, it feels like we're more polarized, maybe even tribal. We're supposedly tolerant, and yet somehow the way we communicate is often marked by intolerance of people who have a different perspective and who quickly get vilified for their views. Underlying this change, and the trend which is most concerning to me really, is the accelerating rush towards a superficiality and communication through email and texting and social media. There's lots of advantages to that, and we have to, this is where we are, we can embrace that. But we need to recognize that this way of communicating promotes a sort of urgency, immediacy, and it sort of takes away the time and space that we have for deeper reflection. And oversimplifies issues as well. I think we can see this drift towards superficiality in our personal lives. I think we can sometimes see it in churches, unfortunately, and certainly we see it in politics. I think it often feels that a lot of public policy decisions are not coming from a well thought through philosophy, but are made on the basis of what could be a quick PR win, what a money-based decision, marketing and metrics, or sometimes it just seems that politicians are wanting to cover their own backs. In my day job, I serve as the General Secretary for IFES, a global network of 160 Christian student ministries around the world. And we see this trend towards superficiality in some of the students that come to our groups. Some of the national movements have called it a discipleship gap. We encounter students who are very fervent in their faith, but there's a gap between their faith and their capacity to live this out. And one of our key emphases in IFES is to try and encourage and equip students to pursue a faith that has depth in reflection, depth in understanding, and depth in the way that they can apply it in their lives. This superficiality that we sense accelerating now is not a new phenomena. If you read the Old Testament prophets, there's a regular call away from the superficial to a faith of depth. And I think it's there very much in the teaching of Jesus too. And all this to say, that's why I'm so proud and privileged really to support and serve the Jubilee Centre in different ways. The Jubilee Centre stands against superficiality. Over the last 10 years, the Jubilee Centre has continued to help people engage more deeply with the topics of concern and to promote deeper reflection and application of God's word into the issues we face in today's world. If you look at the charitable objectives of the Jubilee Centre, they say that we carry out research into what the Bible teaches about social, political, and economic institutions and issues, and come up with policy ideas to provide insights into the problems of contemporary society. The nature of that task, applying the Bible to the issues that we face today, means that we're, as Jubilee Centre, always grappling with the tension of believing that the word of God is eternal and sure. As we read in Isaiah, the grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of our God endures forever. But at the same time, we have a belief that this enduring word has something dynamic, deep, and relevant to speak into the issues that we face in today's world. It's not so important to me whether people agree with every individual article or public policy proposal that has come out of the Jubilee Centre in the last decade. What matters to me more is that the Jubilee Centre has helped me and thousands of others in the UK and around the world to reflect and think more deeply in a world which is dangerously shallow. And I thank God for that. I'll hand over back to Julie.
Thank you, Tim. That was really, really thoughtful, really interesting. Thanks for that. Gosh, there's so much to take in, isn't there, this afternoon? So just thinking, I'll say my bit later. Okay, so while we just digest that for a moment or two, maybe Ralph, no, you're not doing next, are you? Well, we're going to have Ross next to speak to us about his thoughts over the last 10 years and about what Jubilee Centre's been able to do during this last decade. Okay, Tim.
Thanks, Julie. And I'm going to just really pick up the baton from Tim. The notes I made, I was trying to think about how to introduce some of the comments I want to make over the next few minutes. And it sort of came to me in a flash when Tim was speaking, that we know clearly what Thatcherism is and what Blairism was. And I guess what I want to do is try to encapsulate what Tameism is and has been over the last 10 years. And although I now attend an Anglican church in London, I really, my background, my heritage, my upbringing is really non-conformist Baptist chapel in Wales. And so I want to sort of have a few points, sort of alliterative points using all C's. And I want to suggest that really the Jubilee Centre, guided and stewarded by Jonathan over the last decade, can really be summed up in promoting these C's. First of all, the first C, curious. And again, in a world that is increasingly busy, and Tim was describing that really well, and a world that we often feel is dominated by the algorithm, our personal algorithm that Google or Facebook has created for us. The Jubilee Centre under Jonathan's stewardship is an algorithm breaker in wanting to be curious beyond our normal comfortable boundaries. You saw a visual and a picture of all those biblical thinking on ... publications that the Jubilee Centre has published, a huge diverse range of topics that were not always the typical things that Christians speak and think about. And I think that's been hugely influential, not just on the topics that the Jubilee Centre has published biblical thought on, but actually on making us question the boundaries that we put on our own thinking in terms of what we think the Bible applies to and doesn't apply to. Jonathan sort of touched upon that in his own contribution. So point one, curious. The second C is confident. Confident about the relevance of the Bible into daily lives now and in the future. I currently have I've just taken up a role as CEO of CARE, and we work mainly in Westminster, but also across legislative bodies across the UK. And taking that confidence in the Bible's perspective and position and relevancy on topics of the day into the heart of policy-making institutions is absolutely vital if we are still to hold the gospel as salt and light. But I also sort of want to suggest that we've also benefited from the Jubilee Centre's confidence in the whole Bible. Because just as Tim was talking about how society and culture can become reductionist and be interested in presenting simplistic arguments, sometimes we can be reductionist in our own faith, in just picking those Bible verses that we're comfortable with, or even increasingly sometimes people wanting to focus on bits of the Bible that are bridge building, and particular bits of the Gospels that are bridge building, whilst ignoring the important sort of totality of God's word. So I give thanks that the Jubilee Centre has remained confident in the whole Bible's teaching. There's also creativity, which may be a sub-point to confidence, because I think that confidence in that biblical perspective and the relevance of our faith and the gospel into that diverse range of topics, into every sphere of society, every inch of God's creation, as a famous quote put it, has led to creativity in both our thinking, but also our means and methods of presenting biblical thinking. And as my time is running out, I'll move on quickly on. My last C is civility. I think that one of the things that I am deeply and profoundly thankful to Jonathan for is role modeling a civility in the public square. In a contemporary society that is often sort of marked out by incivility in the public square, I'm really thankful for how Jonathan has a thoughtful, compassionate, empathetic tone in his writing and his research and his interaction. I think we saw just a glimpse of Jonathan's humility in his generosity towards other institutions as well as individuals. And I think that tone of civility has been incredibly important, and we've role modelled that. The Jubilee Centre has role modelled that in the ABC, austerity, which was incredibly polarising and divisive, Brexit, which was incredibly polarising and divisive, and increasingly we don't like to use the word, but the seeming culture wars that we have. And I'm incredibly grateful for the Jubilee Centre under Jonathan's stewardship being a role model and a beacon of civility in the public square. So it leads me to my last C, which all those things, curiosity, confidence in the Bible, creativity, and civility. I attend All Souls Langham Place, and John Stott had this famous phrase that we should be conservative radicals. So my last C is that I'm grateful that Jonathan is a conservative radical, not necessarily a big C conservative, but a small c, and so conservative in terms of conserving the gospel, conserving biblical truth, but radical in its application to our modern world. So thank you, Jonathan, for leading a Jubilee Centre that has endeavoured to be and to promote curiosity, confidence, creativity, and civility so that we can be conservative radicals.
Thank you, Ross. That was really, really helpful. And thank you for your 4 C's. It's so much easier to hang things, isn't it, when you've got patterns like that to follow. Speaks the teacher again. That's really helpful. Now, just to remind you, delegates, that all of our contributors today are available in the Q&A. So if you have questions for any of them about anything they've spoken about, I'm sure they'll be glad to give you their thoughts. And so that takes us to our last trustee, Ralph. Ralph is going to give us his thoughts and consideration over the last few years, and Jonathan's contribution to the Jubilee Centre, and what the Jubilee Centre has been able to do in society over the last some years. So over to you. Thank you, Ross. No, not Ross, Ralph.
Thank you. So thank you, first of all, to Jonathan for that wonderful summary of the tremendous reach, if you like, in different ways that the Jubilee Centre has had over the last decade. And again, also to Tim and Ross for their thoughts, covering many, many different areas. The legacy of this last decade is a challenge to summarise, and it doesn't necessarily honour it properly to do it briefly. And I think we'll be talking about this legacy for some time to come as well. I think the first thing that I wanted to say as the chair of the trustees is of our warm regard and admiration for Jonathan himself as he moves on. I think what he's
doing is a tremendous example to many of Christian leadership to move on through God's calling to do something new, making impact in the lives of people, and rather going against perhaps the normal trend, which is to climb ever higher up ladders of organizations. Jonathan feels this very deeply, and we want together to assure you, Jonathan, of our prayers for you, and I hope that we can support you in friendship and different ways as you move on into this project. It's certainly been a great joy for me, and that's probably the thing that is the main feature of my involvement with the Jubilee Centre on a personal level. A joy to be part of things since moving back to Cambridge about 7 years ago now. And the joy isn't just something that's something personal and to be glossed over. Joy is a central feature of our walk with Jesus, and the things that Jonathan has done have worked that in very special ways for people. I think my earliest strong memory has to be of the Reformation 2017 project and all that it involved. Not only pulling in Callum to work at the Jubilee Centre, who was a good friend, and whose life was really changed by his interaction with the Jubilee Centre. I think the Reformation Sculpture exhibition represents something of what Jonathan has done and the influence of the Jubilee Centre that I think is wonderful. So it certainly took an enormous amount of effort and dedication from Jonathan to make the project happen. And again, that's rooted in the vision that Jonathan had for this, for the influence that this could be. And even before the exhibition started, the way that that project drew in people who wouldn't necessarily be natural friends of the Jubilee Centre in Cambridge into the project was really encouraging. I think the output of that was just stunning. The sculpture itself, the place that we were able to find to put up the sculptures right in the centre of Cambridge, was just a very, very significant engagement with people through that project. I myself had several conversations with complete strangers about them, just through standing next to them and looking for people who were inquisitive. It is for me a wonderful example of how a creative vision can transform the way Christians relate to broader society and can influence the way that we can impact. I think we're going to increasingly have to be more and more creative, and perhaps this is one example of what that can be. I reflect from time to time in my work on the way the early church grappled both with thinking and all sorts of other things about who Jesus was and how he was to be understood. And I think this is a lesson for the church today. There's no reason why we shouldn't be grappling in the same way. Another reflection that I've shared with perhaps a few of you in recent years, but it's certainly important for me personally as well, is thinking about the influence of the Jubilee Centre. It's the legacy of people. We've talked a lot about biblical thinking and how important that is. We've talked about the publications, and again, those are a wonderful legacy. The thing that's striking to me, however, about the Jubilee Centre and its influence and its reach is the people who have been shaped and formed by it. So from before Jonathan's time, people like Paul Mills and Jonathan Burnside, for instance, whose careers have almost been formed reflecting on their time at the Jubilee Centre. Listening to the lists of people that Jonathan himself has mentioned, we have influenced people and shaped their lives in diverse ways. We talked about the discipleship gap, if you like, what Jonathan did. And this area of discipleship lies at the heart of Christian influence, forming resilient people to engage confidently with the world, confident in their position with God. And our training has made a significant mark on people. In that sense, the SAGE programme has also been a tremendous effort, and we rejoice seeing former SAGE students representing organisations at COP26, for instance, and different ways in which those young people have been formed and shaped and continue to bear the mark, if you like, of the Jubilee Centre in what they're doing. Perhaps another thing which I think is crucial for any Christian organisation in our times is the strategic connections. And again, Jonathan has emphasised that. Really so important to the survival of organisations. And we again rejoice in those collaborations, the opportunity to be part of the forming and shaping of Christians with wider influence, and forming a Christian mind. Perhaps the conference that has gone in many ways from strength to strength here in Cambridge is a good example of that. We may not always get the credit for these things, but we can be sure of the influence that we've had and the fulfillment, if you like, of the calling that the Jubilee Centre represents. So those are just some of my thoughts. There could, if I had more time, I could go on a lot longer, but I think if we're creating strong and resilient people who can engage with the world, then we can be sure that the legacy of the Jubilee Centre and of Jonathan's time there will be long lasting, and we rejoice in that.
Thank you, Ralph. That's really helpful. As you know, I'm last minute stand-in, so I haven't had much time to prepare, but there's just some thoughts from me before we move on. As I said before, I'm an engineer, and actually this week I've been involved in a sustainability conference with 450 master's students, which has been a feat of organisation, but dealing with case studies on all sorts of different slums in India, fishing and plastic wastes in Myanmar, all sorts of different issues. And you know, as engineers, it's easy to come up with a solution, a technical solution really easily, and say, there is an answer to that. I know how to solve that one. This is what you need to do. And of course, it's not so simple. You have to consider so many other issues, social issues, cultural issues, economic issues, as well as the technical solution that you can think of. And that's what we've been trying to teach and help the students understand this week. But I was reflecting, just listening to you guys just now, about how important looking at any issue through the relational lens, as we've learned to do through the Jubilee Centre, and how to hold in tension the hope that this is a world created by a loving God who loves us enough to sacrifice his son for us, and yet it's damaged, it's broken, and some of that is humans' fault, and yet we've been given the creativity and the thinking skills and the technical skills to be able to solve these things, holding all those things in tension, just as Jonathan was explaining about holding the truths of the Bible with the issues in the world, is something that we are all learning to do, and probably carry on learning to do all our lives. And as Ross mentioned, that was something very much part of John Stott's legacy to us too. Anyway, not to go on putting ourselves on par with those kind of people, but this just so stimulating to think of these things. So that's been really good. Just to remind you again, there's a chance for question and answer in a few minutes' time for the last part of this session. But what I would like to do now is to hand back to Ralph, because as you know, Jonathan is leaving the Jubilee Centre after 10 years, and Ralph is going to tell us something about the new director of the Jubilee Centre starting. Well, I'm sure Ralph will tell us when he starts, but the next Jubilee Centre director. So back over to you, Ralph. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, this is something that's probably news to Gilly as well. So yeah, so I think it was back in March that Jonathan informed us of his desire to move on to new projects. And since then, we've gone through what's been quite a busy process. I can certainly feel that it's been thorough. We were fortunate to be able to engage Carnelian Search, a professional recruiting agency, to help us in the process. I think most of us as trustees felt at least strained in terms of time resources in the process, but I think also just some wisdom from outside, wisdom that was able to look at the Jubilee Centre in a slightly different way and work out what our needs were, was really helpful. And that process too was a wonderful experience of connecting with many people who had impressions and views of the Jubilee Centre. And again, we were encouraged by the warm regard that the Jubilee Centre has across many groups of people. Anyway, through that process, we got down to from, I think, 80 odd people that Carnelian spoke to on our behalf to a shortlist. And again, that was a tremendous process in itself. We had a short list of people, all of whom were appointable, but Tim Thorlby, who we have appointed, was, I think it was unanimous when we discussed things, having interviewed the candidates, that we would appoint him. And Tim's an exciting appointment for us. He comes from the last 4 years establishing and leading a company called Clean for Good, which is a social purpose office cleaning business, operates in central London, and it has actually featured or been mentioned at some of the workshops that we've had with the task forces following the pandemic. So Tim will start work part-time for us on the 1st of December, and we'll move to full-time early February. So it's really from February that you'll be able to see significant differences, or the mark of Tim Thorlby, if you like, coming onto the Jubilee Centre. And I urge you to keep your eye on the website and what's happening with the website, because lots more information than I can give you now will come from there. But I think what you will see is a focus. Tim's experience comes from having seen firsthand how good business can contribute to tackling all sorts of issues, and a business run driven by Christian values and outlook. And he will be focusing very much on the world of business, the workplace, and people at work. That doesn't mean that we won't be thinking about the diverse things that we have been for a long time, but the focus will be around that world as a way of communicating clearly what we're going to be up to. So again, we are very excited. There will be some changes, and some of those might surprise some of you, but I think just to assure you that we've had many discussions with Tim about the direction ahead, and we feel that he's the best person of those that we had to keep the Jubilee Centre functioning, to put us on a firm setting for the future. And I think you'll be seeing as well some new and quite experimental ways of interacting with business that he's planning that are quite exciting. So be assured that his heart lies right at the vision of the Jubilee Centre. Biblical thinking for public life is what was the sort of summary of what we were aiming at, and Tim will be very much doing that, focusing too on the private sector and its place in that as well. So where are we going to now? Back to Julie, is it, or?
Sorry, I think we both clicked it at the same time. Thank you. That's we look forward very much, don't we, to what has in store for us with our new director and where he's going to take it, and also keeping an eye on what Jonathan's up to and what God has for him in the future. Okay, so as I've mentioned a couple of times, I'd like to spend the last part of this session on a Q&A, asking delegates to, if they could just pop questions into the Q&A session, little boxes at the bottom of the screen. Well, it is on my laptop anyway. And we've already got 2 questions on there. So what I'll do is I'll read the question, and then if we can, oh yeah, we're going to have everybody up on screen. So all the trustees plus Jonathan, and then you can fight over who answers the question. Is that the best way of doing it? Yeah. So the first question is about from David Newman, and David Newman has asked, and this is David Newman's words, in a church that is increasingly marginalized in society, how can we not only have something distinctive to say, but also a way to say it that has a chance of being heard?
I was wondering whether we should just give Jonathan the first right of reply.
Yes.
Or is that the kind thing to do, Jonathan, or the worst thing possible to do? We should at least give you the opportunity.
Oh, I mean, I think it's a great question to be asking and to keep on asking, because that is, it's the one we keep on going back to. If you have a sense of, and we have done actually over the 10 years I've been running Jubilee Centre, we've had this sense of, we have got just some fantastic insights and understanding and a perspective and a message and a mission that can really bless the world. And yet, how do we become better known? How do we draw people to that message, to that that offer of hope? So I think that is a huge challenge, is how to be heard in who is it? Tim talked about how much the world has changed and how much it's not enough to have a good message. No one is going to find it. There's so much noise, if you like, and so many different people. Since the internet, everyone can publish, everyone is an author, everyone's an authority one way or another. How do you get fined? And I think for me what it comes down to is the authenticity of real, genuine relationships. And in a sense, people will listen to us when they see we're not just a kind of a disembodied message, but we are living this life. And I think it's a call for holistic discipleship first and foremost, and that we have to earn the right to speak, because there are so many other people speaking, and some of them are very convincing. But what are their lives like? Jesus said, by their fruits you'll know them, not just their good talk. And I think a chance of being heard is just to do what we do really well, and to live that life of compassionate service and witness and integrity in a way that, you may only have 3 people who ever see that, or you may have an opportunity to speak to hundreds or thousands of people about that, or to publish something that is heard or read by many, many people. But I think it's about that quality and authenticity and integrity, which is a key there. So that's just my response off the cuff to that.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's brilliant. I'm sure there's others who got something to say to that one. Ross?
Ready to leap in, but
Leap away.
I think Jonathan's absolutely right that, of course, one of the building blocks of Jubilee Centre is relational thinking, and relationships, I think, are absolutely key, as Jonathan has pointed out. That if you think about, it's cliche to use it, but it's true. If you think about the early church in the 1st century, they didn't have Twitter or mass media and comms channels, but the gospel did spread like wildfire. And that was through people living authentic, faithful lives in front of their neighbors. And I think that in an age where we put a huge amount of emphasis on those social media channels, let alone sort of mass media channels, we forget the significance of living life in person. And so there's relationships are key, incarnational living is key. And I think that Jonathan is an amazing example of that. I'm going to embarrass him now, but Ralph talked about the role modeling that Jonathan's doing in terms of moving on, but what he's moving on to is a form of incarnational living out your faith. But I think also we shouldn't underestimate how it's almost passed over in the question that sort of we have something distinctive to say, and we do have something very distinctive to say. Now, I think the danger is that we focus so much on bridge building aspects of the gospel, the things that the world likes, in terms of, and I've spent a lifetime thinking about social justice issues, but lots of the time those are quite easy conversations to have with non-Christians. The crunch comes when we're really distinctive from the world, often in life issues, and thinking about the human identity and human dignity, when it thinks about absolute claims of truth, and saying that everything is just for the individual to decide and to feel. So I think that if we are faithful to God's word, we will have a distinctiveness that is often very uncomfortable, and sometimes we will have a lot more attention than we actually want. And with that comes persecution and suffering. So be careful what you wish for, because if you're faithfully distinctive, you will get attention, but not always the attention you crave.
Right. Yeah, very true. Ralph, Tim,
just thinking about the idea of influence. I suppose we should never forget that the Christian faith spread from what was a troublesome backwater in the Roman Empire. Judea was something that the Romans would have been glad to see the back of in many ways, because it was also always problematic. And it came through, starting with the life of God incarnate, but then through the lives of those he influenced. And I was struck. It's a story, but I think it's a nice thing to repeat, with the angels talking to Jesus in heaven, and they're looking down at the apostles, and they're saying they're not really very good, are they? And Jesus says, no, they're not. And then the angels say to Jesus, well, so what's your other plan if they fail? And he just said, well, I don't have another one. So Jesus invested in failing, stumbling, troubled people, and transformed the Roman Empire and much further in a very short space of time. So I think again, just focusing on the quality of interaction that we have with people, the quality of relationships, and the quality of what we build into lives has to be the way that we can maintain influence. So
thank you.
Yeah, my notes were quite similar. I mean, the Bible verse that came to my mind was, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and know the Father in heaven. And I think that authenticity and lifestyle is key. The other thing that I think, which came out in Jonathan's presentation earlier on about, I can't remember how you phrased it, Jonathan, but like Hollywood being the place where that's doing the most discipling, maybe even more than the church or something. I think we do need to make sure that we don't undervalue, especially with young people, the value of going into the arts and being a Christian in that sector, because there is an incredible, I know Jubilee Centre has tended to focus on public policy, but the background landscape, creating a space where Christians can still have a voice and not be marginalised, perhaps can come through that salt and light in the arts world. I remember switching the TV on randomly and seeing this guy on stage in Glastonbury singing, Lord, I've been broken, I'm not worthy, but you fix me, I'm blinded by your grace. And you realise that there's a person who I don't think he's a Christian in lifestyle in the same way that I would be. This is Stormzy singing in front of Glastonbury, but he's presenting the topic of grace to an audience of young people, and there's something we can build on. I mean, and you know, Hollywood, Netflix, perhaps, making sure that those people who are involved in content editing and choosing what goes out, that we have Christians there as well.
Wow. Yes. Thank you, Tim. That's that could be a whole topic in itself, couldn't it? But, let's move on. We have another question in the chat, so I'm sure I want to give you a chance to speak on this one too. So this question comes from John, and John asks, what are the key cultural challenges for the UK over the next 5 to 10 years, and how will Jubilee Centre approach these key cultural challenges? You're going first again, Jonathan, or is that unfair?
No, it's not quite appropriate, really. I've done the last 10 years, and alas, my successor isn't on the screen, so I'll have to see what the trustees can chip in there.
Go on then.
I nominate Tim because he's working with the young adults explicitly, so you know, he's got insight what's coming up down the track.
I think in some ways what we've just touched on is one of them, that faith, the cultural challenge is that faith can be easily marginalized, that Christian perspective will be vilified because when we have to say things that are unpopular. I think the concept of cancel culture and the way that it's coming in, it's just easily pushes the Christian voice to the edge. And so I think for me, that's one of the key things. In IFES, when we've done research in this area, it's the top thing that comes up in the Western world is around cancel culture, the rise of secular liberal ideals, and how do we stand for biblical truth in the midst of that. It's worth saying that in other parts of the world, the challenges are a bit different. I think if you're in sub-Saharan Africa, that's not what you're thinking about. You're thinking about the rise and spread of Islam and how corruption and poverty issues. So it does depend where you are, and I think our responsibility as Christians is to have our eyes open. So in that way, the question is spot on. Be aware of what the culture, the ways the culture is challenging us in our faith, and be ready to give a response. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. Any other things anybody else wants to add? What have you given us there, 2 or 3? Any other cultural challenges that other people want to add to Tim's?
Can I answer the question in a very different way, which is to say that I think that the church is, well, okay, let me backtrack already. I think many of the current leaders, well-known leaders in the church and local church leaders who are of an older generation are grappling with the transition from modernism to postmodernism, not understanding that we're now going beyond postmodernism. And so I think one of the things that the church needs to grapple with going forward is critical theory and understanding of power.
Yes.
Because I think that's the prism through which young millennials and Gen Zs are looking at the world and seeing the world and experiencing the world. And why that's important for the church is because in Western Europe, and particularly the UK, where there's an established church, is that critical theory looks upon institutions and cultural norms and how they've oppressed different groups in the past. And I think it's a really sad state of affairs when a gospel and our Lord who came to free the oppressed and bring a radical message to the marginalized and the vulnerable, those very groups now see the church as an institution, sometimes as the agent of oppression on them. Now, whether that's the case or not, it is certainly the truth in some instances and a misrepresentation in others. But I think it is something absolutely that the church will have to grapple with going forward in the West. I think Tim is far more informed about the church internationally. And I'm saying that as we are, apart from you, Jubilee, we're 4 white, middle-aged, privileged guys speaking on topics of marginalized and vulnerable and power dynamics. But I think that is absolutely something that we are going to have to wrap our heads around and think about how our faith and our gospel and the message of Jesus speaks into a framework of power dynamics for generation. The other thing I would just add on this as well is, it is, having started at care and now experiencing, if you like, sort of the corridors of power, it is very scary how that framework of critical theory and postmodernism has had such a profound effect on how we view human life and the identity of being human. And I'm not going to get into sort of draw debates about sexuality or gender or start of life or end of life. But suffice to say that things that we assumed as norms and normative in terms of the value of human life are just not there anymore. And we like to think that they are, but it's apparent in some key public square debates that we can't assume that anymore either.
Wow.
A brief thought.
Yeah, well, it's been, yeah, please, a bit more upbeat, please, Ralph.
It was my thought was.
I was teeing you up, Ralph.
No, absolutely, you're absolutely right, and I think for Christians in that context, the important thing is that we don't lose heart. That we do have something that is the answer to these things, if you see what I mean. So we may struggle with how we communicate it. I have the privilege to connect with a small number of Christians in Egypt, and I was just reflecting with them on the history of the church in Egypt, which was possibly founded by the Apostle Mark, so it's quite old. And there have been Christians active in Egypt ever since. And it's less than 200 years of their history they've not been persecuted, and the joy and the courage that they bring, and the way that even in areas where Islam has been oppressively strong against them, they have worked with people to transform lives, is really encouraging. And that's on the back of the fact that life is really, really hard for them. So I think just that combination of, yes, there is a really significant challenge, but we shouldn't lose heart. And so often the Apostle Paul writes, doesn't he, to say he wants people to know how things are with him, and that your hearts may be encouraged. And I think that's one thing we need to bear in mind.
Thank you.
That was a bit more upbeat, I think.
Let me just chip in one thing. Have become convinced, because there are many times when we think, oh no, this is going to overwhelm the church. This is going to completely take away our position to be able to speak into society. And I think it's just another challenge. It's a more difficult one, but we need to rise to that challenge, because this is what I'm absolutely convinced of, is that no matter what critical theory or the next big idea comes along that's absolutely hostile perhaps to biblical truth and the gospel, actually none of those things fundamentally change the fact that human beings are made in the image of God, and that there are certain things that we cannot change, even if we convince ourselves that things are other than how they are. The fact that we are made in God's image in a way that no matter how much sin we commit or is we are victims of, it doesn't change that fundamental identity. And so there is something there which will always be a touching point, a touchstone where, and it's just a case of finding it, because people will still be deeply hurt and broken, and the compassion and the love of God expressed in whatever way is going to be able to touch those people. And I think that we shouldn't despair, and all the more reason for just to be as authentic and as people who love. We're to be known as the people who love their neighbors as themselves, and you can't really go far wrong if we seek to live our lives but loving God with all our heart and loving our neighbors as ourselves. But it is particularly challenging, yeah, if you are wanting to be salt and light in corridors of power or in institutions, because they are hugely influential on how other people think. So we do need to be able to connect to these the drivers, if you like, of our culture through these different key institutions. But I wouldn't lose hope.
Thank you. I was thinking that the passage then about to always be ready to share the hope that is within you. And that is a challenge, I think.
Yes.
Last question is a lot more upbeat, because it's Fulamani is asking us what advice or recommendations we would give to university students who want to get involved in the mission and the work that the Jubilee Centre does, not just in the UK, but also overseas. So that's a lot more upbeat, isn't it? And I think just as I'm just thinking of the breadth of experience and influence there is on this panel, huge privilege to be able to be involved in all of these different organisations. And here are some university students at the beginning of their careers. What can they do to be part of what the Jubilee Centre does? Go on then, Ralph.
Well, so I think there's several things. So that we've talked about the sort of the broad reach. So there are lots of things that are not just unique to the Jubilee Centre, but are the key for the Jubilee Centre to function, which are about just that, again, discipleship, working on your relationships within the body, working on your own walk with God, gaining confidence, to reach out, sort of going back to what we were just saying before. Ross rightly referred to critical theory and said, if you're confident in your faith, you can interact with that without having to be afraid, and you can diverge from them where they're I think quite often social scientists make good observations, but their treatment for the problem is misdiagnosed, if you like, perhaps. And so just working on that, working on those relationships, I think there is a significant partnership to develop with somebody like the Jubilee Centre, an organisation like us, in terms of just finding the fellowship of people who share a vision to engage with these things. And that's one of the tremendous things I find. And just, I pop into the Jubilee Centre office most weeks, and I mix with a bunch of people who just don't think quite like other people. So I'm hoping, exactly what's on the cards for the next year isn't clear at the moment, but there will be opportunities to interact with this wonderful group of people who are trying to bring that message. So I think that there's a fellowship opportunity. There'll be seminars and webinars and so on. Keep engaged, and who knows? There'll be plenty of opportunity. We've always had interns, and I'm sure we will continue to have interns. So if you're really motivated, then find something to work together with the Jubilee Centre on. We'll have to find ways of funding it, but often the vision will need to come before the funding. So let's think about those ways. I think Jesus said to the disciples, didn't he, that you do not have because you do not ask. So keep asking. Knock on our door. Don't leave us alone.
Thank you, Ralph. Jonathan, would you like to give some final words on that?
Yeah, just to say that I just put into the chat that our online course is a great starting point to gather a group of people. From Lani, if you are in South Africa and you gather a few friends around you, and say, come on, let's do a module of this course together, because it gives you an opportunity to discuss and really engage and think through together about those ideas. And even though they're mostly around a Western and probably a UK setting, you can think about, right, how does the Bible, as we've seen it, this truth working out in the context, perhaps in the UK or Europe, how might we kind of see this, God working in the same way here? And you can get some ideas and inspiration there. So that online course is, there's 8 modules there, 8 different topics, or also broad areas of public life. and do one or more of those together in a group, and I think could be really significant. There's a couple of other comments that says Tim Lawney saying interning with the Jubilee Centre changed my life for sure. And Mercedes as well saying me too. I think there are, these, it's gathering together with other people, which is, and engaging with these. I want to say that for me personally, that our Bible study, our team Bible studies are the richest, engagement with the scriptures that I do. I'm going to really miss that, leaving the Jubilee Centre, and having that, creating those spaces where we can just, wherever you are, to don't wait for someone else to start it up and invite you. You can invite a few friends, say, come on, let's do this together. Let's try and learn together. Because I'd love to see that. I've said for a while, people write to us and say, oh, can we translate the Cambridge papers into our language? And I'd say, well, yes, you can, but I'd much rather you try and get a group of people together, young graduates or young professionals, and you begin to talk together about how you think the Bible speaks into some of the issues that are of concern to you, and begin to write down your ideas and share them with each other, and critique each other's communication of that, and how you apply the Bible, and see where you go, because that is exactly how the Cambridge papers began, with a group of young postgrads in Cambridge nearly 30 years ago. And I'd love to see more and more people doing this, because it's the process which is the most important thing. It's not the, as I said earlier, it's not the kind of a nice glossy Cambridge paper, which is, this is biblical thinking. No, biblical thinking is the process that goes on in our hearts, our minds, as we seek to relate the world around us, and the things, the preoccupations and the concerns and the hopes and the tragedies and the pain of the world, to the message of the gospel and to God's unfailing love. And it's how we do that, how we create those spaces and places for that to take place, which is absolutely what I'd love to see multiplied around the world.
Wow. Thank you, Jonathan. As passionate as ever. Wonderful to hear that. And that's never going to change, is it? You're going to be like that on your deathbed, I can tell. Thank you very much to everybody. We have run out of time, I'm afraid. We do need to bring this to a close. I'm sure there's a number of people here. Please do keep in touch with us. Do carry on sending messages, emails, and so on social media, whatever you prefer. But we want to be kept on our toes. We want to be challenged. We want to know what your perspective on these thinking is. And as Jonathan says, then you can't beat getting together with like-minded or similar-minded, not like-minded. That's too easy. Similar people who want to address these and want to really get to grips with this stuff and just think. So we do encourage you to do that. And so we need to come to an end. So we need to say goodbye to everybody. Thank you very much for being part of this. And do give us any feedback, especially positive stuff, that you can, because we want to learn and get on and do better. So thank you very much. And to you guys, trustees, and especially to Jonathan, thank you very much for doing what you've done today.